that because it is incredibly successful. And I agree with you, and I think the rest of the board would agree that we would love to see this throughout our elementary schools.
One other thing.
Yeah.
Hopefully this isn't exactly what you're going to say.
It is.
Well, I just had a thought.
It is? Go ahead, say it first, just in case.
I just had a thought, as Tom mentioned, the character education, and I believe you mentioned that some student had an idea to create videos and share it on Schoology, but we have a character education toolbox that Dr. Rinelli had worked on that the building principals get to share ideas, and I think some of the things you're doing, that would be a perfect medium to share some of the things that are successful in some of the schools, right? And another way to publicize it.
You got to take this on the road. That's basically what we're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to, one of your recommendations is to increase staff awareness of the wellness policy. That's one step, snack standards. But I would like us to do more than that, but increase awareness to the community. I mean, not just to, and somehow if we could, tout what we're doing for the whole community and a fair of some sort or something like that, that we are taking the whole child, into account. Sort of a a whole child approach, because you only learn if you're healthy and if you're, if your mind is working properly, because you're active, and so I mean, I would like to see us, somehow promote this in the community as well as, sustain our own schools. Yes.
Well, I may have something for you. Well, just when you were talking about the idea of school to garden or garden to school, I know it's come up from time to time, and your presentation made me think about it, that it'd be wonderful if there were farmers markets, and maybe the schools have a lot of space, that's right in certain communities, parking lots that aren't being used on a Saturday or something like that, where if the wellness, if the district could be supportive of the idea of having a farmers market, then now it's fresh vegetables, it's fresh produce, and it's also a great opportunity to put forth that the wellness committee is interested in the wellness of not only the schools and staff but the whole community, and to be I think it's something that's been discussed in community relations.
Yes, we did the whole
probably be discussed more there, but you just made me think of it when you were giving the presentation as maybe a way to kind of tie a few things together.
I know one of the schools that had a garden had parents and students coming in the summer to tend it, but they had so many vegetables that they were able to donate a lot of them to the local food pantry, which is really, another way to give back to the community. People were very enthusiastic about that idea as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a great deal of time talking amongst ourselves, really, how wellness is really not a 9 to 5 or 9 to 3 sort of occupation, and how much it is a community or family involvement. And I guess a lot of my colleagues have said it, that taking it on the road and expand it beyond our district and to get community buy-in and involvement. And we were looking at soliciting ideas and stuff about what is wellness, what constitutes wellness, and how can we can promote each of those things. And I think your report, I think it's stimulating, it's reminding us of a lot of dialogue that we've had with one another over the years on this very subject. So yeah, I'd like to see it expanded and not forgotten amongst us, and maybe perhaps take up where we had left off some time ago. Yeah.
So, Dr. Dawson, you're like, wow, on top of everything else I
Yes, we're going to give everything.
did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for mentioning the mindfulness. For being in education for well over 17 years, I had the luxury of sitting on a PD with mindfulness and getting people in the present, and focusing and watching all those strategies. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. But it was the most sought after one that I've never seen, the response where everyone says, we need that back and we need to incorporate it in all the schools. So that was great. I also like the idea of bringing SEDECO with the advisory committee with the students. I hear that all the time with students. They want to change the menu. They want to change how things are brought in, also how to fundraise. I love the idea of bringing them, bridging that gap and making them responsible and having a voice. So kudos to you for taking that initiative.
Yeah. Jim Giannakis, the manager of Sodexo, is a member of the committee. So, you know, he's right there, and he has probably more ideas than maybe anyone else on the committee. So he's right there, and we can interface with him and set some of those things up. As far as mindfulness, you know, I start a lot of my meetings by having people do, you know, 2-minute, maybe not even 2-minute mindfulness exercise. And I started doing that because I was at a conference that you all kindly let me attend, and I saw a ballroom of 500 people, and this mindfulness expert had us all do an exercise, and all of a sudden it was silent and everyone was paying attention, and I was like, wow. It really works. I mean, it really works, so.
Anecdotally, actually, interestingly enough, speaking of Dr. Epaulette, just as an aside, when he left the Carteret Public Schools, which is where we work together, and went to Asbury Park, right? I don't know if you all know this, but the Asbury Park did a complete, like, 180, like, he flipped that district, you know, inside out. But one of the ways he did it, actually, was really utilizing the counseling staff as well as those folks, and incorporated mindfulness throughout the entire district. Single-handedly, just that alone, like you said, those 3 minutes will change, you know, the life of a trauma patient or the life of anyone. But to do that throughout a district, I think, is awesome. So yeah, we recognize how important it is, but that's a little well-kept secret that Lamont used that when he was sort of turning around Asbury Park. But thank you so much for everything that you're doing, and hopefully you'll find a few minutes in your day to, you know, make this really bigger and like and start a food bank and maybe yeah. So we'd like to see some vegetables in here by next year. Yeah. But thank you so much, because it was the first year and you're doing a great job. So just keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Great job.
There is another part of our superintendent's report tonight. I had asked, as you know, the school funding formula is in the news again. It comes and goes in waves, and there is some discussion at New Jersey school board level as well as the state level in the legislature as to what the future of the formula would look like. We received some additional state aid this year. However, the government budget is not approved, but insofar as State Senate President Sweeney has asked Acting Commissioner Repaulette to how is he going to revise the formula, asking for ways that he will. I did ask David to give a short presentation tonight to refresh our memories as to what all those things that are bandied about at the time we use, such as adequacy and underfunding, equalization agencies, so that we could refresh our minds on what's going on in the news, and hopefully, if there comes a point that we can express a point of view on it, we can do that in a mindful way. So, Mr. Slater. Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, anybody whose portion of the meeting is over, like
Feel
Dr.
free.
Dawson,
Yes.
you're welcome to leave. Ms. Ortiz is the Director of Pupil Services who came to support Dr. Dawson tonight. Thank you for coming. Yes, go ahead.
You can go ahead and start.
Okay. So, turn the lights off. Maybe we should close our eyes and think of a peaceful place and regain our focus.
Atlantic City, money.
Yeah. So Teresa mentioned school funding has been in the news lately, really a lot more over the last 15 months. This board has been heavily involved with it, going back 8-10 years ago, and Teresa thought it was a good idea just to kind of go over some of the terms. It can be quite confusing, and I hope you leaving here today, you know, you're a little bit wiser, or you learn at least one thing from this presentation, because there's so many names and acronyms, and
and aspects to it that, again, it can be quite confusing, so. The School Funding Reform Act, just as a reminder, it was a result of a 5-year review to change the school funding formula, which it replaced what was called CEFA, the Comprehensive Educational Improvement and Financing Act. And it was, I believe they started studying it really in 2002, had their plan by 2007, that's the 5-year plan, and they implemented it in 2009 with funding. Since 2009, it has not been, it was run properly the first year, and since then it has not been run properly, and the cumulative underfunding to districts exceeds $9 billion over the past 8 years. Adequacy budget. So this is a term that you'll hear a lot when you start talking about school funding and SFRA, and it's really one of the bases of SFRA. So the formula calculates what they feel an adequate budget is to provide a thorough and efficient education to the students in the district. It starts with a base cost per pupil, and then it makes adjustments to those costs based on various factors, which I'll get into in the next slide. The base cost for 2018-19 was $11,209. And the October 15th ASSA enrollment count, where we provide a count of the number of students in district, is important in the calculation of the formula because so much of it is driven on a per student basis. That's a reason why our auditors not only audit our financial records each year, but they do actually audit our ASSA counts from October 15th to ensure integrity across districts across the state. So they have that base cost per pupil of $11,209. And what kind of adjustments do they make? Well, there's a factor for grade level. Middle school and high school students get a slightly additional weight because of the typically additional costs involved with middle school and high school students, whether it be extracurricular activities, things like that. The at-risk population, which is your free and reduced lunch population, there's a weighting there that increases the cost attributable per student to provide a thorough and efficient education. Bilingual students, and then there's an additional weighting for students who are both at risk and bilingual. So all those additional weight factors are applied based on our population of students that qualify for any of those areas. And it inflates the calculation of what we need for our adequacy budget to provide a thorough and efficient education to all the students that are reflected in our community. In addition, there's a factor for a portion of the special education costs. In 2018-19, the estimated additional cost to educate a special education child was $17,343. 2/3 of that for each special education child is included in the adequacy budget. And then there's a geographic cost adjustment. Each county has a weighting factor to reflect the disparate costs across the county. You know, costs in Bergen and Hudson County are significantly higher than in Salem County, so there is an adjustment for that. So according to the formula, in 2018-19, the adequacy budget to educate the students in Piscataway was $113,397,580. So this adequacy budget is the basis of has two components. It's split down into two components. What's the local fair share? How much should the local municipality provide towards that adequacy budget? And how much should they receive in equalization aid, which is aid that comes from the state of New Jersey? The fair share, local fair share, is meant to represent how much the taxpayers should contribute, and it's based on two things. It's based on the income from the community members in each particular town and the property values of all the properties in each particular town. And they weight those two aspects, property values and income for each town, and they put it into the formula, and that helps to determine what the local fair share is for each town across the state. It's meant to level the playing field, okay, when they apply an equalization formula to property values in town and income in town. In 1819, the local fair share for Piscataway was calculated as $90,510,582. And you can see there our local tax levy was quite close, $91,188,701. The other component of the adequacy budget, equalization aid. So again, basic math says that if you have an adequacy budget and they calculate the local fair share, well, the balance should be made up in equalization aid from the state of New Jersey. If we were to do that formula, that 113 million minus the 91 million, which is our local fair share, we should be receiving in equalization aid nearly $23 million. Our actual equalization aid is 10.6 million. So we're not getting the full amount of equalization aid that the formula says we should be getting. Okay? Hence, we'll get into terms such as underfunded. This is the beginning of the explanation of what that means, that we're underfunded. In addition to equalization aid, the state provides what they call categorical aid, which is specific aid in other categories that are specifically tied to certain things. Security aid, it's a flat amount per student, and there's a supplement for additional money that based on how many at-risk, again, at-risk refers to free and reduced lunch students in your district. Special education categorical aid. I mentioned earlier that $17,000 figure that they determined is the additional cost to educate a special education child. 2/3 of those costs go into the equalization aid. The remaining 1/3 is in what they call categorical aid. It's just a different category, a different form of state aid. And then transportation aid. That's based on the number of pupils that are eligible for transportation. Again, our auditors, another thing they look at besides our financial records, besides the ASSA, is every year we have to do what's called the DRTRS. It's a district report on transported students. The auditors look at that. Why? Because it's a component of transportation aid. Aid confusion. Here's some more aid words related to state aid that are tossed around and just further muddies the waters whenever you hear them. And what all these different terms do, you know, educators, legislators, reporters, they all talk about state aid. And because there's so many terms and so many ways to look at it, underfunded, overfunded, adequacy, underadequate, overadequate, it just really creates a whole lot of confusion. So I'm going to try and explain some of these other terms. And again, hopefully by the end you get a little bit of a sense of where we are in the scale and what some of these terms will mean. So state aid growth limits and caps. When SFRA was first created, the intention was to distribute the money across districts in a fair and equitable way. But they realized that to do that, they weren't able to attain it in 1 year. They weren't going to be able to make the adjustments in 1 year. So they put in what they called growth limits. So you had a whole bunch of districts that were underfunded, you had a bunch of districts that were overfunded, and they had to find a way to kind of reallocate those dollars. That was the intention. So they put growth limits in terms of how much the underfunded districts could receive in any one given year. Some could receive an additional 10% of how much they were entitled to, some 20%. And that was based on, again, whether a district was over-adequate or under-adequate in their spending. In theory, if this was applied, in 5 to 10 years, every district would be at their full SFRA funding, and the adjustments would be made. Unfortunately, the reallocation across districts never happened, and that's because of the next term I'll get to, hold harmless aid or adjustment aid. Sorry, it's on the next slide. Hold on. First, uncapped aid. So the growth caps and the limits limit how much districts can receive. If there were no growth caps, no limits, if the governor said, you know what, SFRA is a fantastic formula, we're going to run it, we're going to fully fund it, and we're going to give districts everything that the formula says they should get. If that was the case, Piscataway's uncapped aid would be nearly $34 million. Okay? It's not likely to happen anytime soon. So as a result, we're capped, we're subject to caps, and stabilized aid is the term for the amount we would receive, the amount of state aid we would receive if they started phasing in the growth limit. So if we got the extra 20% that we should be getting over the next 5 years, year one would be stabilized aid of $20,287,000 for Piscataway. Adjustment aid, hold harmless aid. So this is the crux of part of the problem. I said there's a whole lot of districts who, according to the formula, are getting more state aid than what they should be getting. Well, when SFRA was implemented, there were many legislators who did not want to tell their home districts that were overfunded that you have to give some money back. So the state came up with what they called hold harmless aid or adjustment aid that kept those districts whole. They were promised they would not lose any aid. They would keep the amount of aid they had at the time, back in 2009 with SFRA. And it was meant to stay in place for at least 3 years and then possibly phase out, and it never phased out. So districts that were overfunded in 2009 continue to be overfunded to this day. And when you have a very fixed pot of money, if you're not willing to redistribute based on the formula, then you'll never really attain that equity across districts that the SFRA formula says we should achieve. Okay? So the adjustment aid, hold harmless aid, it virtually has guaranteed that overfunded districts remain overfunded.
May I ask a question? Just to understand, the held harmless piece of it, though, doesn't necessarily connect or have a correlation with any particular funding itself. It's just sort of protecting the existing funding.
The amount that the district...
Correct. So it's not an additional or anything that would have come. It's just a matter of ensuring that those districts that were overfunded can stay there, can stay in that place where they, with their budgets.
Yes.
Okay.
So like, correct me if I'm wrong, but say a district like Brick or Bound Brook, so for whatever reason they were at their full funding, they still get their full funding, even though their enrollment may have dropped, they should be entitled to less, but nobody ever cuts.
Correct.
Right, and the example that I always think of is when we talk about it in New Jersey school boards is Asbury Park, where the whole tenet of this was the aid supposed to follow the needs of the children. So as the children move around the state and the money's supposed to follow them, that didn't happen. They did it once, 2009. So these Asbury Park is like 100 and something, I don't know, like they're way overfunded, and but they still keep getting the money because they're held harmless.
So David, is the adjustment and hold harmless aid, is it used as a separate categorization? In other words, is, say a district was getting $10 million in aid in 2009, and the formula called for them to be getting $6 million in aid. The aid they currently get, is it now broken down into, they're getting $6 million in one kind of aid and then $4 million in hold harmless aid or adjustment aid?
There's a line on the aid sheet's adjustment aid, yes. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sorry to report on that line, Piscataway does not receive any.
Yeah.
A couple other aid categories, preschool education aid, we actually do receive that. It's been consistent for us, $442,200, specifically earmarked for, preschool program.
Excuse me. Is that included in the 10 million, or is that in addition to the 10 million?
The 442 is outside all the numbers I've been discussing thus far, the equalization aid, the categorical aid, the preschool education aid is
So it's
outside
in
that.
addition to the
Yeah.
10.2 or something?
Same with the extraordinary aid. That's outside of that as well.
Okay.
Extraordinary aid was put into place to provide additional funding for high-cost special education students. And you see parameters there, depending on whether you send students out of district or in district, whether they're in a public placement or a private placement. We have to report, as a matter of fact, the period is open right now for us to report our special education costs from the current year. We have to report them up to the state of New Jersey based on a spreadsheet with these formulas and these thresholds, and we find out how much our extraordinary aid was for the 17-18 year. We'll get that notification in July. So as you can see, I referenced here the 16-17 extraordinary aid. That's because we got that last July. We won't know the extraordinary aid related to this year until July of 2018. And even that aid figure, you do the whole calculation, you have those thresholds, 90% of costs above $40,000, you do the whole thing, and you might think you're going to be entitled to $1 million. Well, they only funded it at 56.75%, so you're only going to get $560,000.
So David, so is it beneficial to a district to have inclusion? Will we get more state aid for having inclusion?
In general, it's more beneficial to have your special education students in district because the overall costs are cheaper.
Okay.
Because the amount of extraordinary aid you get back, you can see, it's only the amounts that are above 40,000 or 55,000. It's only a percentage of those costs that are above. And then furthermore, you only get a percentage of that because the state doesn't fully fund it. So, ultimately, it's most cost efficient to districts as much as possible and as much as it meets the IEPs and the best placement for the child to keep in district.
I was just saying to Teresa though, but even after you do all of that on a yearly basis, you wait to hear that they're like, oh, we're only going to fund this much of it.
Yeah.
And you never, that changes.
Correct. So, for example, I've budgeted for the district in 17-18, the budget we approved a year ago, $900,000 in extraordinary aid. I still don't know how much we're getting. We'll know in July. But I expect it to be at least that much. These were some other aid categories that had been in place the last few years that we received money for, but they weren't actually in SFRA. Several of them the previous governor had put in place, and they were, frankly, I think they were a way to spread money across to numerous districts without running it through the SFRA formula. So the park readiness aid, the per pupil growth aid, under adequacy aid, professional learning community aid. The park readiness and the per pupil growth aid was a certain dollar amount per pupil, and they tied it to specific programs so that they felt it would withstand scrutiny of not falling in the SFRA program. Park readiness. Well, we're going to give every district money so they can prepare for park. And those four categories are not in our school aid for 2018-19. They were, in essence, eliminated or set aside. So what's our aid summary? This is kind of a summary of some of the different terms we've covered. Listed there, we have the adequacy budget, the local fair share, and what our equalization aid should be. Here's the reality. Our adequacy spending, again, that does not equate to the budget that we approved. Adequacy spending, frankly, is a formula that I don't have all the components of for you. The state budget software calculates it. But I think it's inherently the cost for staff, supplies, professional development, technology, etc. I believe capital costs are excluded. So the budget software's calculated amount of our actual adequacy spending is $101 million. And that's reflected in the equalization aid they gave us and what our local tax levy is. Those add up to what our actual adequacy spending is. Per the formula, we are under adequacy, but we supplement the budget with other types of aid and miscellaneous revenue sources. So, like I said, our budget, our general fund budget this year is $121 million, and we went from 101 up to 121 through a number of mechanisms. We have a capital reserve withdrawal, we have miscellaneous revenue sources, we have fund balance that we contributed towards the budget. So that's how we bridged that gap to go from the adequacy spending of $101 million to what our actual budget is of $121 million. Again, just a recap of a couple of the key numbers. Our uncapped SFRA aid is nearly $34 million. If they were running SFRA and applying the growth limits, the growth caps, we should be getting just over $20 million. What are we actually getting? $17,751,747. So our underfunded state aid amount is about $16 million for 18-19. So just for comparison, and I picked Jersey City because there's been a number of articles in NJ.com about them. They are considered one of the most overfunded districts when you, again, selectively how you apply the terms. The superintendent of Jersey City wrote an article in NJ.com that made it appear as if they were underfunded, and that gets into the nuances of the argument. Jersey City is not meeting their adequacy budget, but in terms of state aid received, they're receiving more state aid than the SFRA formula says they should get. So there's a gap between how much they're raising for their local fair share versus what they should be raising for their local fair share. So their adequacy budget, and these are 17-18 figures, is $625 million. Based on SFRA, they should be paying $370 million in local property taxes. They should be getting state aid of $255 million. Instead, their actual local contribution is only $114 million. Their SFRA aid that they're receiving, what their actual aid that they're getting is $411 million. Okay? So the SFRA aid, according to the formula, is $255 million, they're getting $411 million. So it's about almost $160 million a year extra money. The formula says they should contribute $370 million in local property taxes. They're contributing $114 million in local property taxes.
Any idea what the number of students is in that district?
I can find it easily, but